Hi again, everyone. Michael here from Mirrors of Consciousness and creator of the Orbifold Tarot and upcoming Arcanamex Tarot with the second installment to my series on the Marseille Tarot. I wonder how many of you did the homework from last week of getting a flowering plant or a bouquet of flowers and observing the blossoming of the flower and then the decaying and wilting of the flowers. There was a point to that exercise, and that point will lead us straight into this installment, which is to explore the foliage, how the foliage changes and grows through the minors of the Marseille Tarot. So just an overview of that without looking at the cards, that idea is kind of an overview of the Ace to 10. So without really getting too much into the numerology aspect of that, which we could certainly get into, and I will probably later, but I've already looked at that to some degree with the Orbifold videos. If we just look at the overall cycle from Ace to 10 and the cycle of a plant's life, we have the bud at the ace. We could even go further back and we could say that the ace is the seed. But in that particular exercise, the bud is the ace. The opening of the bud, the just opening as it starts to crack open, it's not really a flower yet, but the opening of that bud is the 2. And then further opening where you kind of start to see inside the flower and maybe the color of the flower, maybe if it has stamens. I'm thinking of lilies or something like that. That would be the 3. And then as it opens a little bit more, it's not fully open, but it's certainly more open. That's more like a 4. And then it's fully open is like 5, 6. And then as it starts to wilt a little bit, that's kind of the 7. And then it starts to droop, and that's the 8. And then it kind of starts to wilt a little bit more and shrink. That's the 9. And then eventually, if you leave it long enough without cutting the flower off, the flower itself will actually drop off the plant, and that could be considered the 10. Another kind of nature-based way of viewing the ace to 10 cycle is the ace as the seed, sprouting as the 2. The division of the first 2 leaves apart could also be the 2, or for some people they could consider that the 3. And then the development of a bud, a flower bud, could be the 3 or 4. And the opening, so the cycle is just a little bit longer. So the flowering phase would actually only be the phase from between, let's say, 4 and 7 for the life of the plant. And then again, wilting would be kind of around 7 or 8. But as the flower drops off, it leaves a seed pod. And so when we get near the 9 and 10, yes, it's the completion of that particular phase of life for the plant, but the cycle is started again around the 10. And the seed pod, depending on the plant, they're all a little bit different, of course, but certain seed pods contain many, many seeds. So you go from a single seed that generates a plant, ace to 10, ace to 9-ish, and then that at that 10 point, when we get the seed pod and the seed pod falls to the ground, now we have several seeds that can potentially become several plants. So there's a generation happening, a multiplication happening there at the natural level. Of course, plants do that because not all the seeds survive, not every seed grows, but that's also in reading tarot. We see, just because you get an ace, people are often excited. Oh yes, an ace, new beginnings, fresh start, world of potential. Well, not all seeds that are planted, even if they're watered and well cared for and all of that, not all seeds grow. And we kind of have to recognize that when we're reading tarot, is that not every new beginning bears fruit. So bearing fruit on fruit producing plants would also be probably around the six or seven. The seed, of course, is contained in the fruit, right? So the flower is kind of just the attractive part of the production of fruit in order for the plant to get pollinated and blah blah blah. But it's I don't want to make it into a botany lesson or anything, and I'm certainly not a botanist. Certainly learned a lot more about botany in the process of creating Arcanum X, but I'm not a botanist. So I don't want to give a lesson on botany, but thinking of it in that cycle, in that natural life cycle, will help give us an insight into how the heck do we read these minors that just have leaves and objects on them. And part of that exercise too in observing them is not just observing the flowers but observing the leaves, and as leaves grow and change shape and wilt and dry out and they make different forms, and we can interpret those forms in various ways. And it's not that the forms in and of themselves necessarily mean anything. They don't. They mean it's a plant living its life and doing its natural thing. But we're naturally, especially if we're doing any kind of divinatory practice like tarot, we're naturally the type of being that likes to draw parallels. So the turn of a leaf may resemble the turn of a coat, like Ganesha's robe here. The turn of a leaf may indicate something like the turn of a collar on a piece of clothing, or may reach up like fingers, or may wilt like a sad person, or we can make parallels, we can make connections between the natural world and ourselves and our experiences. So that was kind of part of that exercise of either going out in nature if you're in a climate that there's that natural stuff happening in, or just buying a bouquet or buying a flowering plant and just observe it. Just keep observing it. The thing about plants too is that their cycles are they're slow, but they're not really that slow. There are certain cycles that last only a week, say, like with a bouquet of flowers, they only last about a week, maybe two. If you watch the entire cycle, maybe a month. But if you're going to watch them from 1 hour to the next hour, they're not going to change that much. But day to day, they do change quite a bit. So that can be, it's just an interesting exercise in recognizing cycles. And it's, even though the cycles may seem slow, they're actually not so slow, considering that seasons take a year to go through a full cycle. And but there are certain points along the year that we notice changes in the cycles. So that's all just to say that reading with the Marseille Tarot, any tarot, but especially reading with the Marseille Tarot, is an exercise in observing cycles. And of course, that's something I've been interested in with the Orbifold as well. But because there's foliage as a decorative aspect of the Marseille Tarot, it makes that observation of cycles a little bit more immediate or a little bit more personal than, say, the Orbifold, where the cycles are more abstract. So to illustrate that, I'll actually turn the camera around and I'll lay out some cards and show the development through each suit. What may be helpful if you want to go along with that, because every Marseille Tarot, every edition of the Marseille Tarot is slightly different, so there's always going to be slight variations. It might be helpful to get out your deck and separate it into the 4 suits. You don't need to worry for now about the court cards or the major arcana, you can just separate that completely out of the deck and set that aside. But take the 40 minors and set the 40 minors in order from ace to 10 and suit to suit, so that all the coins are together, all the swords are together, etc. And once you've done that, come back and we'll look at the progression through the suits. So I've got all my pips sorted out. Today I'm using the Francois Chausson Marseille. So let's take a look at one suit from ace to 10. We'll look at the swords first. I'll look at all of them, but we'll look at them one at a time. So when you set the 1, the ace, and the 2 side by side, often the aces actually are kind of a separate thing. So sometimes you need to take the aces separate. But if we look at just the form around the ace, these flames or leaves that are coming off of the ace, they're forming this similar kind of Vesica Pisces shape that's seen in the 2. So the ace is actually indicating what's coming next. It's showing these flames of inspiration are actually laying the template, laying the ground in the ace for the 2. And then in the center of the 2, we have kind of this vertical shape. I mean, there's a flower, but overall it's a vertical shape. And if we follow the color, then with the red, that shape then grows into a third sword. Then these kind of buds on either side, if they were going to grow together, they would then wind up creating the fourth, another pair of swords. So the central sword disappears and it actually becomes a flower, but the buds on either side become the next set of swords. And then the flower in the middle of that one becomes the sword in the middle of the next one, the 5. And then those same buds on the 5 become another pair of swords to form the 6, but the central sword disappears and becomes another flower. And so on. And it goes all the way. That pattern kind of repeats itself, where the odd numbers have a sword in the middle and then only buds on the sides, which then those buds on the sides grow into additional swords. And then on the even cards, the flower in the middle becomes another sword. Just arrange these a bit. What's also interesting looking at the swords, the curved swords, when we lay out all the swords side by side, is we get actually a visual connection. We get all these circles happening between the cards. And that's another aspect that's really important, I think, about reading with the Marseille Tarot, is that we're not really looking at individual cards. We're looking across the cards and between the cards. What's going on between the cards? So if you have two sword cards side by side in a reading, you've got a closed circle. And so you look at, well, what's enclosed in that circle? Or maybe you have a card in between two swords. What's enclosed inside that circle? And then even what's on either side. If you had a different card on either side of those two swords, what is a half circle that's opening out into a different card? I'll give an example of that later in another video. For now, just looking at the suits. But you see how the progression goes, and the flowers turn into objects, objects turn into flowers, flowers turn into objects. It's also seen quite clearly in the wands. So even the shape of the flames on the Ace of Wands, set that in the middle to start with. Even the shape of the flames on the Ace of Wands is more vertical. There's a more upright shape, whereas on the Ace of Swords, it's a little bit more rounded, like the successive swords. The direct correlation between the ace and the two, again, is not so direct, except that this middle wand becomes then two flowers. And then those two flowers become a central wand. And then the foliage on the sides of this Three of Wands then become the additional wands in the Four. And then that wand in the center in the Four becomes a flower. That flower then in the Five becomes a wand again. So you see this, again, kind of constant transition between wand to flower, flower to wand, wand to flower, flower to wand. And as we go, the foliage, even on the sides, each of these leaves on the sides is a little bit different. So between the 2 and the 3, the foliage on the 3 has a little notch in it. So this leaf has grown the way that leaves split as they grow a little bit more. And that split is then what makes the 4. And then that foliage becomes fresh again. But is slightly different here too at the base. There's a split at the bottom of the foliage at the base that continues. Then at the 6, we mark a very different foliage. So the leaves on these 4 cards are very similar to each other, but at the 6 it becomes a different type of leaf. And at the 7 it's a different type of leaf again. The 8, no leaves on the sides, but there's that central wand that's hinted at by the 2 flowers, and that then becomes a wand. And on the 9 of Wands, we see no foliage at all. So we can read into that various different things too. And at the 10, that central wand then splits into 2 wands, and the foliage returns. So it's again that idea of a cycle where the foliage is most, the growth of the foliage is most prolific kind of in this area around the 4, the 5, the 6. And then it kind of dies back again a bit, as if we're kind of going into winter here around the 8, 9. The 9 might be winter, the 10 might be spring, leading toward the ace again. Normally we might think of the ace as the spring, but often we forget that the spring comes on the heels of winter. And there's always those buds that poke through, even through the snow at the end of winter, just before spring starts. So there's this cycle. And here it's a very different shape, where in the swords, the overall shape looking back at the whole suit is this series of circles. The wands is a series of X's, and yet there are some circles inside the wands formed by this bar that crosses the wands and the roots of the foliage. It's not really the roots, but the base of that foliage. It forms these smaller circles in the middle, and then it forms larger circles. So the wand is actually in the middle in some sense. The wand is in the middle, if we could make this transparent. The wand is in the middle of this circle that's formed by the 2 sword cards, and it's like concentric circles growing out and rippling out. At the same time, all those straight lines in the wands are also hinted at in the swords. So we can derive all kinds of different meanings from that. Could be things like thought and action are interrelated, that between thought we must perform action, or between actions we must first think about what we're going to do. All kinds of other things. I don't want to go so much into that, but just looking at the forms differently can give us other clues as to what's going on. And then there's also these lattices here. So you can almost think that this lattice with the crossing of the 8 swords, it's like the lattice that's formed here. So this is like the top, and maybe this is like the bottom with an extra wand. So there's parallels, there's visual parallels that are drawn, and there's certain repeating shapes, repeating forms, repeating concepts. Visually, design-wise, there's these repeating things that at first glance just seem like, oh, well, what's the difference between this card and that card? They all look the same to me. And they do, but once you kind of understand those visual cues, you can start to see the differences also between them. We can continue through the progression of the suits with the cups. So again, we kind of get this negative space shape where this line becomes the division of the bottom part of the 2 of cups. This larger form at the base of the Ace of Cups becomes that smaller flower from which these grow between the 2 of Cups, and then this large section splits off and becomes the 2 fish or the 2 gargoyles or whatever they are, and then the flower here. So the negative space, the space between the 2 actual cups on the 2 of Cups, is the Ace of Cups. So showing how the Ace of Cups splits into the 2 of Cups. And then pay attention to this shape up here. That then becomes the 3rd cup in the 3 of Cups. And these 2 cups move down. This foliage doesn't really change a lot, but this, what is originally an organic object in the 2 of Cups, then becomes an actual object, a cup in the 3 of Cups. Then that theme also continues, and we can see maybe this flourish in red here becomes the base of the next 2 cups, and the shape of these seed pods becomes the shape of the actual vessels of the cups in the 4 of Cups. And that cup, again, it's this kind of constant transition between foliage and item, foliage and item. So this item then becomes foliage again here. And then that foliage becomes an item, becomes an actual cup, and so on. And we keep going back and forth between foliage growing, and as the foliage grows, it becomes an object. And then as more foliage becomes objects, objects turn into foliage again. So this central flower here becomes the cup in the center. Actually, this whole central column in the 6 of Cups of foliage becomes a central column of cups. And these 2 lateral cups here become foliage, whereas the bottom and top 2 cups on either side remain cups. Then that central cup becomes foliage, and the lateral foliage becomes cups. And then but we have more foliage growing around those cups. There's foliage here and in the center and here, and then that foliage becomes 3 cups, and the 2 cups in the center becomes foliage. So, but this foliage stays. It changes. It splits again, similar to how our leaf in the 3 of Wands split. This leaf splits into the 9 of Cups. These leaves stay the same, although not quite the same. The leaf uncurls a little bit from the 8 to the 9. And then in the 10, no more foliage. There's two cards in the minors that have no foliage, the 10 of cups and the 9 of wands. From deck to deck, sometimes there is foliage, but a common thing is for those two cards not to have any foliage, which is very interesting too. But we can see that growth of a cycle, and it's almost overgrowth here. If you look at, even though we have a 10 here, it's a higher number, it's actually more spacious, it's more open, because all this foliage has been cut away. It's no longer there. So again, we can derive different meanings from that those meanings stray from some of the meanings we might be more familiar with a Waite-Smith based deck. Finally, we get to the coins, and we'll see a similar pattern of growth, foliage becoming objects, objects becoming foliage. So in the ace of coins, we have this one coin in the center, but the foliage growing off of it kind of creates two round shapes that then become actual coins. So those two round shapes became actual coins. The central coin became this ribbon that joins the two. In the 3, it's a little bit different. These two pieces of foliage on either side become these two coins. This coin becomes foliage on the bottom. This coin remains a coin. It shrinks, but it remains a coin. But then there's more foliage that grows around it. You can guess what's going to happen next. These two flowers, these two buds, grow into coins. This coin is going to become something else, like so. And this foliage moves down. And so it's hinting, this is actually hinting at the 6 of coins as well as the 5 of coins. But first we get the 5. So that shield in the center becomes an actual coin. And there's not much change in the foliage. But these two pieces are going to hint at our 6. So the central coin becomes a flower, and the foliage on top and bottom become coins, and then these leaves wind up wrapping around the coin to become the 6. And that pattern just continues all the way through the minors. Here, these two bottom leaves, which are actually slightly darker in color in this particular deck, they're slightly darker in color than at the top. And so those darker leaves then become split and become coins, whereas the coin becomes foliage. And then at the top, this reverses. So these become coins too, and these become foliage, and in the middle there's a coin. Right? That central flower moves up a bit and becomes a coin. So the pattern just continues on, where the spaces are filled in different ways by coins or by foliage. So again, here this coin actually splits off into 2, or these two pieces of foliage become 2 coins, and this central bud opens. We can almost think that this has come this way, and then it opens that way from the 7 to the 8. And then from the 8 to the 9, that central flower becomes a coin. And that central coin becomes a flower again. But then these two flowers, top and bottom, between the 4 coins on each half of the card, then become coins. So there's this constant development of foliage to object, object to foliage. And it's just expressing how we also grow, how we're interconnected with our environment, our actions, our thoughts, our friends, and how there's a constant back and forth, a relationship between all of the things around us and ourselves, and how we form ourselves based on the environment around us. The environment around us then also forms and shapes ourselves. So that's kind of an overview of the minors, the 40 minors. Um, so take out your Marseille deck and just study them each suit at a time. Take much more time on your own with them than I did in that overview. And just look at how do the forms morph from one card to the next. And for this particular exercise, do it in order. So go ace to 10. How does the ace become the 2? How does the 2 become the 3? How does the 3 become the 4? That once you kind of learn that way of looking at the minors, that's going to lend itself really well and easily to the next stages. So enjoy, and while you're at it, buy yourself another bouquet of flowers and watch them.